Number 10 said the government made no apology for trying to protect the public from serious, violent and persistent foreign national offenders. The challenge meant, and we start to learn some of their offences now, a killer, a firearms offender, 2 individuals who'd committed rape or other sexual offences, 7 violent criminals and 14 drugs offenders remain in Britain. Let's speak with Maria Thomas, who's a solicitor at the firm Duncan Lewis, acting for a number of the Jamaica 50. I would obviously not ask their names, but what sort of convictions do the people that you're acting for have had? Good morning.
Good morning. Without going into details of the specific convictions, we're not saying that there were no serious offenders on this flight, or scheduled to be on this flight. That's not our position. What we are saying is that obviously there has been some problems in terms of reviewing these cases. Don't forget there was 2 separate parts of litigation going on Monday night, or throughout the Monday and late into the early hours of Tuesday, as that the procedures for giving notice hasn't been followed, in the sense that there hadn't been access to mobile phone coverage for a number of the detainees, and that's why everyone in Heathrow RRCs were ultimately not on the flight. Secondly,
were there no landlines?
Pardon? Not accessible. So
what do you mean not accessible?
As in, there's 1 or 2 phones that have been accessible. But the point is,
so phones were accessible.
Not to the extent where all of the detainees could contact their lawyers. Bear in mind, these type of charter flights, the only way to get you can't just issue judicial review proceedings. You have to get an injunction from the court. This takes time. So, right. The reason the 5 days is important is because once you get the notice of the removal, these people need access to the lawyers, access to justice.
So presumably they've already had their case heard prior to this. So they've already been convicted. They've already then been, if you will, scheduled for deportation. So it's not come out of the blue for them.
Well, I think what Monday's litigation showed us is that there were people on that flight, whilst their cases had been considered, clearly serious issues hadn't been raised. So if we represent several people.
Yes, I started by asking what their offences were. What sort of offences are we talking about?
So, for example, you mentioned the drugs offences. We represent a number of people with drugs offences. At least 2 of those have been referred to the national referrals mechanisms as potential victims of trafficking, because it appears to be the case that these were groomed as children themselves by drug dealers into selling drugs through the county lines networks. And obviously this is hugely important, because if we accept that they were groomed into to dealing drugs, they should be perceived as victims. And ultimately,
what about the people they deal drugs to who lose their lives? What are they? If they're the victims, what are those people?
Absolutely, they're the victims. I'm not in any way saying they're not victims either. But I think it's really important to remember that we've introduced the Modern Slavery Act. People are being recognised within the county lines sort of context that they were themselves victims. People are successfully appealing their criminal convictions at a time. On these grounds. Now, if we have a number of individuals who came to the UK as children, 4 or 5-year-olds, at some point in their early teens, they become groomed. They fall into this.
I don't think you become groomed to rape, though, do you?
No, I don't think you become groomed to rape.
So why is it necessary? You may not be acting for any of these 3 rape or sexual offenders, but why do we need to keep them?
We're not, again, as at the point I made earlier, is that we're not saying that no one should ever be deported. We're not saying that the government should not have the right to deport people. What we are saying is that the procedures need to be followed, and we need to make sure that the cases are properly reviewed. I think one of the points that we've made is that the Windrush Lessons Learned review was commissioned because clearly there were errors were made, very, very serious errors were made by the government in relation to the Windrush scandal. We are not saying that everyone on this flight or have got direct Windrush connection. What we are saying that from the leaked report that we heard of last week, there are some include some recommendations. For example, that no one who came under the age of 13 should be deported.
I see.
Again, I'm not saying that these recommendations will be implemented. But our position is that until the full report has been published,
right,
it should be considered.
Lastly, the Times says that you're acting for 14 of the 17 people, so the chances are you are acting for the killer. Do you think that's made Britain a safer place?
We're not acting for anyone convicted of manslaughter. And I think the point is not, as I said before, the point is that there may well be some who the government can successfully deport under the powers that are available to them, but they must still follow the appropriate and correct procedures, because otherwise they cannot be held accountable.
Yes, and do you think this makes Britain a safer place, as the government are indicating they rather fear it doesn't?
I don't. The problem is these people have already been processed by the criminal justice system. They've been punished for their crime. Many of the people on board have only had a single conviction. If you were,
how many rapes do they have to do then?
Again, my previous point is that the
two. Would
the
that
point
be
is
enough?
that
Three.
The point I'm trying to make is that the person who someone who's born here, or someone who comes as a 2 or 3 year old, going through the same criminal justice system, they're being punished for their crime twice or even 3 times, because they're being detained after they've served their criminal sentence, and then they're faced with deportation.
All right, I'm grateful for your time. I wonder how their victims feel.